Good morning, everybody. My name's Clara Hemphill. I'm interim director of the Center for New York City Affairs, which is a think tank at the Milano School of International Affairs Management and Urban Policy at the New School. And we're always recruiting students, so if some of you would like to get a master's degree, we have admissions material on the desk outside. I want to welcome you all this morning. Were any of you on the homeless count last night? Okay, well, thank you particularly. How late were you out? Till
5 a.m.
5 a.m. Okay, well, that shows dedication to both causes. Thank you very much for coming. And I also want to thank the Child Welfare Fund, which has supported this project of Child Welfare Watch for many years. We are interested, this year in particular, our events are looking at how the de Blasio administration is doing. Homeless families is certainly one of the issues that the mayor has been very concerned about, and we're taking a look in this report to see how he has been doing, and we're also going to take a look in the panel afterwards to talk to people both in and outside the administration to see how that, whether things are getting better or worse or whether they're just about the same. I have to apologize on our program. We did not mention the most important person to this event, which is Kendra Hurley, who is the senior editor of Child Welfare Watch. She edited the report and wrote a big chunk of it, along with Bruce Corey, Evan Pellegrino, and Abigail Kramer. So I'm going to call up Kendra right now to give us a summary of the report.
Good morning. I'm going to present findings from the latest report, which looks at babies and toddlers living in shelters. And before I do, I also want to thank the Child Welfare Fund because this research wouldn't have happened without their support. And just echo the thanks to people who worked on this report, including Abigail Kramer, Bruce Corey, Evan Pellegrino, Nicole Mader, and Clara Hemphill. And I also want to thank the advisory board. A few of you are here today. And at the beginning of the report, there's a section of solutions and recommendations, and that always comes, the reporting informs the advisory board, but the advisory board are the ones who put those forth. New York City's family homeless shelters have been bursting at the seams for years now. Over the past decade, the number of families spending time in the Department of Homeless Services shelter system has skyrocketed, with over 25,000 families living in shelters over the course of the last fiscal year alone. When we talk about homelessness, the conversation is typically and understandably focused on families' most pressing needs: the need for jobs that pay a living wage, the need for affordable housing, the need for subsidized childcare so that parents can work and find a way out of the shelters and into permanent homes. There's no denying that these are the critical issues facing families in shelters. But what often gets lost in the conversation is what we are here to talk about today, which is the emotional needs and experiences of families in shelter, including those of children. Families spend on average over 400 days living in shelters. For children, and especially young kids, that's a developmental lifetime. How can the city use this time to support rather than derail a young child's development? How can we create environments in shelters that protect and nurture strong bonds between kids and their parents? How can we help families that are leaving shelters that may be the only homes their children have ever known? A little over a year ago, the New York Times documented in devastating detail the effects of living in Fort Greene's now shuttered Auburn shelter on the 11-year-old girl, Dasani. In interviews with homeless families and the service providers working with them, we at the Center for New York City Affairs heard numerous stories echoing Dasani's plight. We heard about the shame and stigma of homelessness that attaches to each family member. We heard about the frequent antagonism between shelter staff and the families they work with. We heard about the overcrowding and general stresses of parenting in public. and also about the watchful, seemingly ever-present eye of the foster care system. As we wrote in the latest issue of Child Welfare Watch, for homeless school-aged children like Dasani, school can offer security and consistency. It can become the place where they might connect with adults who have not only the desire, but also the resources to help. But babies, and sometimes their homebound parents, have no such outlet. So today, as we talk about the experiences and challenges facing families and children in shelters, I hope that some of the conversation focuses on babies and toddlers, for they are overrepresented in the shelter system, but often get overlooked when it comes to resources. In the latest issue of Child Welfare Watch, which is here today, we found that children 5 years old and younger make up about 1/3 of all the kids in New York City, which is about what you'd expect. They also make up about 1/3 of all the kids living in poverty. But in shelters, children 5 years old and younger make up 45%, or nearly half of all the kids. I recently learned from Judge Adams at the Department of Homeless Services, who you'll soon hear from, that some 1,800 babies were born in city shelters last year. We know from science how important the early years are to our lifelong development. We know that trauma and chronic stress that often go hand in hand with issues like poverty and homelessness can derail young children's development. Thankfully, we have also learned from research over the last decade that there are interventions that can help parents protect their kids from those kinds of stresses and trauma. Our previous issue of Child Welfare Watch, titled Baby Steps, profiled the handful of service providers in New York City that offer these types of interventions to help families buffer young kids from the sometimes brutal impact of living in poverty. These interventions typically work with a parent and baby together to help strengthen the parent and child bond and to promote what's often referred to in the world of infant mental health as nurturing, responsive parenting. As all of us who are parents know, it can be really difficult to practice calm and collected parenting when you yourself are stressed out. The stresses that homeless families face are intense, to say the least. So many of the most effective interventions for parents and their young kids also provide elements of basic case management to address practical issues, like if a family's on the verge of eviction, they might get help connecting to legal services. As it can be hard for parents with babies to travel, the most effective of these also set up shop where parents with young kids already are. They're in pediatric clinics, family court, daycare centers. But by and large, we found that these types of interventions are not reaching the places where some of the city's most vulnerable young kids live. They are not in homeless shelters. In fact, we found almost no initiatives in shelters designed to promote the healthy cognitive development of young kids. Most measures for babies, designed for babies focus on safety, such as crib checks to promote safe sleeping. Sadly, we discovered that the most likely way for a family to receive services for young children, or say something like maternal postpartum depression, is to be reported to Child Protective Services on suspicions of abuse and neglect. 25% of families have cases open with the Administration for Children's Services. About 13% are through foster care or preventive services. This is a help that goes hand in hand with stigma and fear, which is, of course, the fear that your kid's going to be removed to foster care. The good news is that our reporting also covered a new and growing sense of urgency in the city to provide families with young children other readily available ways to receive help. We found fledgling initiatives that are working to bring to shelters parenting programs that protect and strengthen the parent and child bonds. You will soon hear from Janee Harvey of the social service organization CAMBA about her efforts to bring an evidence-based parenting program to its Brownsville shelter. You'll also hear from Judge Adams about how the Interagency Children's Cabinet has made the cognitive development of vulnerable babies and toddlers, including those in shelters, its next top priority. And you'll hear from Anthony Graham, who operates a large family shelter in East New York, about his efforts, his low-cost efforts to link families to neighborhood service providers. You'll also hear from Joyce McMillan, a parent organizer from CWOP, and Christy Parque of Homeless Services United. So during the panel discussion, we will no doubt hear disheartening stories, statistics and stories about the conditions of shelters and the experiences of families inhabiting them. But we hope to also find evidence that the de Blasio administration is taking first steps to protect not only the safety, but also the development of some of the city's most vulnerable children. To do so is a chance to meaningfully invest in thousands of young lives. And now I want to introduce Judge Adam, who is the Department of Homeless Services Special Advisor to the Commissioner for Child and Family Issues and Shelter. Judge Adams, who will give a presentation, was previously at the Administration for Children's Services, and she also worked as a judge in family court. Thanks.
Good morning, all. Good morning. Yes, I was a judge in the family court for almost 20 years. I sat in the Bronx for 2 years and Brooklyn for 3 years and then Manhattan for almost 15 years. So, can you hear me now? All right. I won't repeat the resume. And then after retiring from the bench, I was at ACS for a year as an advisor for child welfare practice. And then when Gilbert Taylor, who had been the deputy commissioner at ACS for child protection, went to become commissioner of the Department of Homeless Services under the new administration, I followed him as his special advisor for children and families in shelter. First off, the new now year-old administration at DHS has a strong child protective orientation. Commissioner Taylor was at ACS. I was. Lorraine Stevens, the first deputy, was at ACS. Peter Hartley, Keisha Joyner, Andrea Reed, a good number of people came from ACS. So we tend to see the job of the family shelters as child-centered. I want to explain to you a little bit about how the system works, how shelters work, what kinds of shelters there are, how they're run, etc. Because when I first came to DHS, I had absolutely no idea about the different typologies. I thought a shelter is a shelter. In fact, there are 3, and I'm only going to talk about family shelters. There is at DHS a division of family services, but also a division of adult services. And the adult system is something quite apart. I don't really focus on it that much, and this will be devoted to families, which are defined for purpose of shelter as either a single pregnant woman or at least one adult with a child under 18. There are 3 kinds of family shelters in the system. The first, and in our view, the ideal, are called Tier 2 shelters. And Tier 2 comes from a state regulation setting out guidelines for provision of shelter. You must always remember that the city is a creature of the state, so we are at DHS governed by the New York State agency OTDA, the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. So anything we do derives from OTDA, derives from the state, all the definitions of how our shelters are run, what kind of services we have to provide, everything comes from the state. So there is a state regulation called Tier 2 that defines a kind of family shelter. That is a freestanding building that was built to be a shelter that in most cases has fairly rich child social service support. There are daycare centers, there are after-school programs. In many of the larger ones, there's a doctor or a nurse practitioner on site. There are a rich array of case managers and good social services. So they are, as far as we're concerned, the best and richest place to place families. The second category of shelter are hotels, and these were buildings that were built to be hotels that have been taken over by DHS to house families. They are, in some respects, less desirable than Tier 2s because the facilities are not built to be shelters. So some of the units will have fairly jerry-built kitchens, maybe burners with small refrigerators, microwaves, not full kitchens. The rooms are often studios, single units, and there can be 2, 3, 4 family members in a studio. And the social services are not as rich or as available as they are in a Tier 2. And the third kind of shelter, and the kind that we are trying in this new administration to get out of, are called clusters. They used to be called scatter sites. And what clusters are actual apartments, regular old apartments, that are either in apartment buildings in which DHS has every apartment, or are mixed in with regular rent-paying tenants. And they have proven to be the most difficult because they are the hardest to deliver social services. There's no supervision. And in a strange dynamic, when families get into apartments and stay for a year and a half, as typically they do, they think they're living in an apartment. And they are. And when it comes time to push to move out, to look at rental subsidies, to look at move-out programs, it's very hard for the family to think about moving out. The children have been in stable school situations, they're used to it, and these apartments, in some cases, are big and comfortable. There are maintenance issues in many of the buildings, there's no question about it. There are repairs that have to be done, but they're apartments. So these clusters are hard to manage and challenging. DHS only operates 4 shelters ourselves, and that number is coming down rapidly to 2. We directly operate 2 Tier 2 shelters. One is called Flatlands Family Residence in Brooklyn, and one is called Jamaica Family Residence in Queens. All of the other 128 shelters are operated by private contractors, by social service agencies who contract with DHS to provide social services, maintenance, security, etc. There are, in some cases, providers who are operating without contracts, and one of our goals is to bring every provider to contract by the spring. The relationship with the providers is not unlike ACS's relationship with agencies that provide foster care and preventive services. We exercise oversight, but these providers have a great deal of discretion and are, in most cases, the direct frontline contact with the clients. And the providers range from being very good to being less than very good. And we are instituting a new accountability review system for these providers. Now, some of the initiatives that Commissioner Taylor has undertaken are aimed first at avoiding families going into shelter, second at accelerating families' moves out of shelter, and third, improving the quality of life for children and families when they're in shelter. So first, as to prevention and avoidance, there is a program called Home Base that has been around for a while at DHS that is being dramatically expanded. And Home Base provides eviction prevention services, one-shot deals to pay arrears, mediation between tenants and landlords to avoid eviction, mediation between families and family members who are perhaps fed up with having the family and children living with them. We have found that the number one cause of families entering shelter is eviction, and the second is overcrowding and living with family members who can no longer support this additional family unit. So Home Base is being substantially increased. We have many more offices now than we did before, and are aiming to fortify the prevention effort. Related to that, we are considering decentralizing PATH intake. As you all know, I think, there is now one intake center for families seeking shelter in the city, and that's the PATH Prevention, Assistance, and Temporary Housing. It's on 151st Street in the Bronx, right off the Grand Concourse. It was, in all fairness and with due respect, a triumph of the Bloomberg administration, because before there was PATH, there was a horrible intake center called the EAU, the Emergency Assistance Unit, on Powers Avenue in the Bronx that was a hellhole. and families and children were sleeping on chairs. So this building path is a beautiful, state-of-the-art, clean, well-lit, beautiful, beautiful building. So that was one of his great triumphs. The push for decentralization comes because it's very hard for a family in Far Rockaway, obviously, to come with all of their children and all of their bags to this one location. So we're thinking about an experimental, decentralized intake center somewhere in Brooklyn, in one of the neighborhoods from which we get many families, either Bed-Stuy or East New York or Brownsville, and we're looking at that. And that would be not just intake, but working together with home base, so that when a family came to present for shelter, we would try every way possible to not put them into a homeless shelter. So that is another initiative we're thinking about. Move-outs, this is an area in which the administration has been aggressive and pretty successful so far. There are 3 new subsidy programs. We now have preferences at NYCHA. We have 750 units set aside for families coming out of shelter. We have preferences for Section 8 vouchers and a sort of renewed focus on Section 8 vouchers, and a LINC program that you may have heard of, LINC, Living in Communities. And there are 3 kinds of subsidies for which families are, rental subsidies for which families are eligible. LINC 1 is targeted at working families. And one of the things that stunned me when I first came to work at DHS is that 1/3 of the families in shelter have an adult working. Mostly full-time, mostly minimum wage, many stably employed, 14, 15 years at the same job, but either through extraordinary family circumstances, illness in the family, just can't afford an apartment. So LINC 1 is targeted at working families. LINC 2 is targeted at families who have been in the shelter system for a long, long time, and there are many of them. They're called long-term stayers, and there are families who've been there for 5 years, for 6 years, who may leave for a while, come back, leave, come back, who are chronically dependent on the shelter system. And then LINC 3 is for domestic violence survivors. And we are working closely with HRA to try to enhance our shelter capacity for families who are fleeing domestic violence. So those 3 move-out assistance programs are new to the administration. And then our final focus is to improve the lives of children in shelter. It's very hard to be a little child living in a homeless shelter. It's isolating. It is socially isolating. One thing that I've been working on, and this is a challenge, is allowing visitation in shelter. Particular in Tier 2 and hotels, there are regulations about having people who are not part of the family unit visiting in the family shelter. So if the little girl's in first grade and makes a good friend, she can't bring her home after school. There is an emotional barrier on the part of many parents to having the children play with each other in shelter. They're mistrustful of other shelter residents. They don't like going into each other's units. So children are socially isolated in shelters. We're trying to focus on that. A second piece of work, and in many ways we're working with ACS, and I must point out the genius Sandra Davidson, who's the greatest caseworker who ever lived at ACS, which is trying to, when families first present, gather better information about them so that we can understand the particular needs that they have and identify children who may require intensive monitoring and supervision, children who may be at risk for maltreatment. So we are working with ACS on that. We're working to develop new intake instruments, gathering better historical information about the families, and attempting, as much as our capacity crisis allows us, to place children in the kind of shelter that would benefit them the most. Now, the Children's Cabinet that was mentioned is another mayoral initiative to bring together all of the city agencies that work with children and develop certain programmatic focuses. And one of them is 0 to 3. And we are working with DOHMH, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, to develop a 0 to 3 initiative in shelter. As we said, 1,800 children were born in shelters last year. There are 7,200 children who are 3 and under living in all city shelters, and these children need intense intervention and focus and attention. So we're working with DOHMH to build something on a visiting nurse kind of model to make sure that the children are seen regularly and that the parents are provided with supports. Because again, it's very hard to give birth in shelter. You're cut off from a lot of supports. And finally, there's an arts initiative in shelter. We are working with about 5 or 6 organizations who want to bring their skills to help children living in shelter, and we are going to, in a systematic way, bring ballet and dance and theater and painting to the children who are living in shelter so that they can get the emotional benefit of that work and explore their own potential and futures. So that's a brief overview of where we are, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. Thank you.
So now I'm going to call up the panelists. We have Anthony Graham, who's executive. We do have Anthony Graham. No. Where is he? There he is. Hi. Executive Director of Help USA Shelter in Brownsville. We have Janee Harvey, who runs foster care preventive services for young kids at CAMBA, also in Brownsville. We have Christy Parque, who's Executive Director of Homeless Services United, which represents the shelters. We have Joyce McMillan, who is a parent, formerly a shelter resident, and now with the Child Welfare Organizing Project. And we also have Judge Adams. So I'm going to start with Anthony Graham.
Oh, boy.
You heard Judge Adams's summary of what's been going on. Does that conform to what your experience is as a shelter provider?
Basically, it does. Yes, there are the different types of shelters that are out there, and that prior to this administration, what was geared towards the shelters was getting people in and out as quickly as possible. We were giving time frames in which to get them out and quotas and so forth and that sort of thing. So yes, we were, that things they're doing. This administration is showing itself to be kinder and gentler. We still have this overall issue going on, and that is the family's ability to be able to get into the shelter system in a non-traumatic manner. Once in the shelter system, being a balance between having them be held responsible for themselves as well as offering the services that we want. And when it comes to the children, I guess I would stop right there and say one thing. Children in the shelter system have little to no voice, little to none. They are, I thought I'd talk, I was a very loud talker all the time. little to no voice. So when the children come into the shelter system, the system is so geared towards getting people in, getting them assessed, getting them into a place of comfortability or somewhat near comfortability, and then meeting with them every 2 weeks and every week and so forth. That, what we forget to do a great deal of times as shelter providers is trying to soften that blow for everyone, to make them know that we are facilitators. That we can offer.
Let me interrupt you. When you say you trying to get people into the shelter in a non-traumatic way, can you describe the trauma of getting into the shelter?
Let me put it this way. I always use this example. You have planned a trip, and all of a sudden you thought you were going to the airport, and you go to Port Authority. Okay, New York City Port Authority. And you get into Port Authority, and all of a sudden you have no idea what bus you're supposed to get on, where the bus is at, where do you buy the ticket, there's 16 different places in which to get into and so forth. You are confused. You're confused. But all of a sudden you've come to some place and asked for services. And you get into that environment. And once you get into that environment, you are being rushed along. You're being rushed along. You're being asked to do things in a very, very staccato way. You're asked to answer questions, have birth certificates with you, have all this stuff with you, and you're supposed to know what you're supposed to be doing, and you're supposed to maintain your humanity. How do you do that? Yes, 2 o'clock absolutely right. 2 o'clock in the morning, a rainy day. You've got your children with you. You've got all this stuff. Somebody's telling you to bring 2 bags with you, but you have more stuff than that to bring with you. You've just come out of a situation that was somewhat traumatic, and you're being brought into another situation that's traumatic. You have to maintain your dignity. How do you do that?
Let me ask Christy Parque to follow up on that. I mean, what is it like for people when they're first getting into the shelter? What is the intake procedure like?
I think Anthony sort of portrays the system that we have, and I think the Judge Adams did a good example of sort of procedurally what happens. But if you think about and use the word humanity, and I think it's what we forget is that by the time people end up at PATH, they have been traumatized for a variety of reasons. Up to 50% of folks have experienced domestic violence. They have probably utilized all of their resources. They've been, likely rejected from family because they can no longer stay there. They are dealing with the pressure of being a parent, all of these things. And by the time they show up at the door of PATH and, are placed in a shelter, they are really beleaguered. They are beaten down. Their self-esteem is down. There's a sense of failure. When I think of people like Anthony and some of the other providers, they see them as survivors. These are people who are keeping it together. Their family, is intact in whatever degree that they're showing up at PATH with. But by the time they get there, they're really feeling like they've had to, both at the same time, create a protective barrier to get themselves and their family to the front door of the system. But the system is now requiring them to completely open up with somebody that they don't know. So you have to explain, possibly in front of your kids, basically what you would perceive as a parent, your failure to keep that household intact. When in fact, as we know, homelessness is fundamentally about poverty and lack of affordable housing. So you show up at the door, you have to then make yourself vulnerable enough to say, I can't do this alone, I need help. And you've come through a very traumatic situation, stressful with just, whatever belongings you can carry, pulling the kids out of school, taking time off from work, that kind of situation. So by the time they show up, they have at least told their story to at least 3 or 4 people. And each time, opening themselves up, opening their heart, and talking about it. And what that can do, if it's not done in a way that is protective, it can reinforce factors. And this is traumatic factors. And so this is something that I'm really happy to hear the judge talking about, that we're as much as possible preventing them from actually coming into the system, and having folks like Anthony understanding that when they come in, we have to welcome them in a way that sort of recognizes that they have just come through an intense period, and we need to give them a little bit of recognition that they've survived, they've shown up at the door, and we'll begin working with them with this knowledge that there's trauma that led them to that front door.
How much of this is something that a city administration can do something about? Domestic violence,
Yeah.
poverty, lack of affordable housing. I mean, these are all huge, huge issues. And whether somebody at the front door of the shelter is welcoming or not, how much difference does that make? Maybe Janee, you want to answer that?
I believe that the political landscape is at an exciting time in New York City. As we heard from the judge, there's some innovative ideas. There's some great minds working on these issues. Gilbert Taylor, Jamani Hilton. These are compassionate, skilled, resourceful people leading the way, looking at getting families back into communities. Echoing what they are discussing is, if any one of us in this room suffered a loss of our home through something like a fire, that is a time that usually communities become superhuman. This is when we rally around the people in our community that have lost everything. And yet there's something about the homeless shelter system that has stripped us of our humanity, that doesn't have us rallying around families. It actually has us dehumanizing families and children. And I think the political landscape is such that we can be superhuman. We can say these are families that are on the radar. These are kids that we're getting into UPK. These are kids who need intensive parenting. They deserve it. They are facing the worst obstacles of their life in that moment, and we as a system can do something about it. Instead of going back to that idea, if you lost your home and you live in Brooklyn, you wouldn't then go to the Bronx. You would go to where your family is, where your kids are in school, where your kids are maybe getting therapy. And really the system needs to be flexible and human and look at those things. Keep homeless families where their services are. Many of them are involved with ACS, so they're already getting foster care prevention services. Now when they move boroughs, we lose track of these families sometimes. These are the worst families to move out of the very communities where they have roots. And I think there's some really great ideas coming out around maybe doing that, even decentralizing intake. You know, I would hope that that would be one of the outcomes, is trying to keep families in communities.
Yes.
I've been in this field for over 30 years now. When the system was first designed, each borough had an intake place. It had a tier 1 that you came in, and from that tier 1 you went to a tier 2. It was a little gentler and so forth. But I asked this question of everybody, shelters as well as providers.
I'm sorry, it was gentler when were you talking about?
There was transition periods. You came in, the family got settled. They weren't, it wasn't, okay, we found a shelter for
under
you.
Giuliani, under Dinkins?
This was under Dinkins, and then Giuliani started trimming it back, and then it got trimmed back more by Bloomberg, and now we're coming kind of back to what the original mission was and how we're doing under de Blasio. But I ask this of everyone. When a person comes into your shelter or comes into your service, if you're part of one of the service providers that provides it, is there a welcome sign? Do you say welcome? Do you say, how are you today? Do you go back to the basics of humanity, of saying to them, I'm not casting any judgment. Say welcome. I took over Help One, and she and I were talking about this earlier, a couple of years ago. And one of the biggest things that I've been trying to get them to do, and it's reflective of my organization or anybody's organization, I said, where's the welcome sign? Welcome to Help One. And the person walking through the door feels a little bit less, frantic about somebody saying, welcome, rather than, here, you're at Help One. Here you are at, you're at CAMBA services, or here you're at such and such. That welcome, and the people that greet them, understanding that they're there to greet them, to make sure to say hello to them, how are you doing? Does the child need a cup of the water?
I'm going to interrupt a minute there, because I wrote about homeless families during the Koch administration many years ago. And at that time, I remember interviewing young mothers, and the only way that they could think of to get an apartment was to go through the homeless shelter. And that, I don't know if they had up, I wouldn't say they had up a welcome sign, but it was seen as the only way to get started and to get your own. And so if you open up the doors too much, you get a flood of people. And if that's the only way that people can find housing, you get a.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily, I think you have layers of clients. You
There, I
don't
mean,
have-
there's. I'm not blaming the families in this. What I'm saying is that there's an endless supply of people who need housing in this city, and how do you deal with that? Maybe you'd like to answer that.
I want to jump in on that
Yeah.
because the insinuation,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the insinuation that people are trying to get free housing by going into the shelter is completely absurd to me. I've experienced the shelter, and I would tell you, I don't care whose administration I'm under, I don't want to be in a shelter.
And which administration were you under? Was it the?
I was in a shelter in 2000, from 2000 to 2004, Bloomberg.
Yeah.
And it was horrible. But I knew people who had been in the shelter prior, under Giuliani, under Dinkins, and it wasn't much better. The person at the door saying hello and asking you a few questions and making you feel comfortable is one scenario. The other scenario is the apartments that the city paid for that are roach infested, mice infested, leaking, mold. No one wants to live in those type of conditions. So I completely disagree with that.
I'd like to step back for a second and paint a little bit of a big picture, because you asked a really good question, and I think, your question was, can a city agency do that? I think one city agency cannot do that. I don't think that it has been fair for the Department of Homeless Services to pick up the slack for the failure of all the other systems that touch these folks. We know that there have been a lot of systems, both city and state systems, that have touched the people coming through. And it's, what has happened is that the homeless system has become a catch-all, regardless of family composition, whether or not it's the single side or the family side or the adult family side. It's become a catch-all. So the question is, can a single agency solve this problem? And absolutely not. But a city can solve this problem, and having things like a children's cabinet, having a really unified effort around homelessness, really bringing in all the city agencies together can solve this problem. But I think as a city, we can't afford not to solve this problem. And you see different pieces of it. And again, if you go back to what's causing homelessness, and we have income inequality, there's this idea, and I agree with you, I think the best place for people to receive services for families in crisis and trauma would be in their own homes. I think everybody would agree that we should be putting as much resources, and the city's doing that now that we have Section 8 a little bit, we have not enough, we have 750 units of NYCHA, again, not enough, but it's a start. Love to see 1,500 or more. And we have all the different LINK programs. We have 5, but 3 for families. I think those are good starts, and we should be putting as much of our resources to helping people stay out of the system. Even if they come in, we need to get them in and out as quickly as possible. But if I may speak for Anthony, I think what we're talking about is the approach that for those who have unavoidably end up in the system, what is the approach to how we interact with them and their children? What is the understanding of what brought them to that system? And I think as a city, we can't afford not to. And I don't think we can blame a single agency. I think it's a city problem. I think, we have, 1 in 3 kids who experience homelessness nationally, and I think that number is the same. I should ask Kendra what that number was, or Judge Adams, but this is a city problem, and we're beginning to address it. Things like universal pre-K, really important, addressing issues of better assessment of kids coming in, but we can't really keep doing what we were doing, which is one size fits all, and blaming a single agency. That just doesn't work, and it doesn't solve the problem.
Well, we're trying very hard to do that. The Children's Cabinet I told you about, and also Deputy Mayor Barrios Paoli has set up an interagency task force on homelessness. All of these agencies work together. We now have at DHS regular meetings with ACS, with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, with the Department of Education, which is a huge issue for children in shelter, and the Department of Investigation. So we're talking to each other as much as possible. It's the only way.
My concern is that we have all of these cabinets and we have all of these different agencies who are speaking to each other, but who are speaking to the people who experienced it? Because that's where the change is going to come in.
Well, I will say that DHS has hosted CWAP at least twice.
Yes, I met with you.
Yeah, that's right. We've had, CWAP has been with us at least twice. CWAP has reviewed, one very interesting issue we deal with is something called client responsibility.
Yes.
If there's say a mother in a shelter assaults another resident, what is the response supposed to be? If you put her out, you're putting her children at risk. Do you, provide more intensive services to that mother? Do you try to mediate between the mother and the other individual? But we have taken pains to bring in CWAP and other, CWAP's kind of unique, but there are a few other organizations that are like that, into our review of our client responsibility procedures, et cetera. So we are, under Commissioner Taylor, we're really making an effort to do that.
I would say Judge Adams is correct. I've met with her personally. My concern is regular meetings, having homeless people, families who have been affected by ACS at the table, on the committee for every cabinet that exists. Not bringing them in when you want to hear the short story, because that's the same thing that happened on the assembly line when I entered the shelter. They heard the short story, and people made assumptions from the short story. And I can tell you their assumptions were not true.
One of the problems that Kendra identified was the fact that when you come into the shelter, some families have really complicated problems, mental health issues, domestic violence, very, very complicated issues. And some, honestly, don't have complicated issues, they just need a place to live. Is there any way, Janee, that you can distinguish between those kinds of families in the beginning?
So I work with families after they're already in the shelter system, so I cannot speak from the point of intake. And I did read Kendra's article, and there seems like there are some ideas around assessing families from when they come in. I think there would have to be a lot of thought about who's doing that work. Is it a quick, as she mentioned, factory line, tell me your quick story assessment, I'm checking box, you seem depressed, now let's get you going. That doesn't work. It needs to be embedded in a relationship. When we are working with families at CAMBA in central Brooklyn that are already in the shelter system, there are huge gradations of what families are struggling with. Because I am contracted by ACS, we get deeply into the family dynamics. We see parents with complex trauma. We see parents who think a 2-month-old can hold their own bottle and they refuse to hold them. But because we are have really critical contact with the family, we are aware of the families we're most concerned about. And then families that are pretty high functioning, and they are literally just experiencing an episode of homelessness. They need a little help getting out of the shelter. The families that are in the shelter who have the deepest need, in some ways, I think you have to kind of see it as a blessing is too strong a word, but the families that are at least on the radar and they're accessible. We can actually work with them if we're willing to give them wraparound services and work with them. I would assume Anthony and his staff know the families they're most concerned about in their Tier 2 shelter because they have contact with them, daily contact. They know the parent who's struggling to get the kid to school every day. This is an opportunity. So blessing is too strong of a word. It's an opportunity to deeply affect families. And we're doing that with Safe Care, which is a weekly, one-on-one, skills-based parenting program showing parents how to bond and attach with their baby, showing them how to make health decisions for their babies. And there's real opportunities to deeply support these families in the middle of a crisis.
Judge Adams, do you want to comment on that? On how you can identify which families really need the most help on the way in?
Well, there are all different ways in which you can need help. Their medical problems are under-recognized. So many children need glasses or have asthma or need intense medical care, and we haven't figured out yet how to provide medical care to children and families in shelter. Often families end up using the emergency room as the physician because there's nothing nearby. We should, I've always thought it would be interesting to set up relationships with local pediatricians, like pediatricians in the neighborhood. So if your child falls down and, you know, gets a bad cut and needs to have something looked at, rather than calling 911, going to the emergency room, which happens a lot, the shelter should have a relationship with Dr. Jones, who's, in the neighborhood. So don't overlook medical issues and disease as a problem. And also parents have health issues that they need to take care of. But I think it sort of speaks for itself that the families are, by definition, in crisis.
Another question, do you know how, does anyone know the history of how they decided to have one intake center in the Bronx rather than one in Brooklyn and one in Queens?
Well, I wasn't there at the time, but I think, first of all, the physical decrepitude of the EAU and the horrible experience that families had in the EAU animated the building of a new shelter. And I think, to some extent, and I understand it, centralizing it made the placement function more efficient, because don't forget how many people we're dealing with. You've got 25,000 children. Just children alone, 25,000, and you have to figure out where to put them. And I think that it was a technological experiment, and I highly respect it, that the family would come and through a centralized kind of intake process, you knew where there was an opening and you knew where the family could go. As it turns out, there are flaws in it, but I think that was the theory behind centralizing it.
Do you want to jump in? Anyone else?
There was actually, previously, under Bloomberg, his plan to end homelessness, the idea was to expand to the different boroughs, and then the recession hit in 2007, 2008, and, limited funds for that expansion made it impossible. I think, I can't speak for the mayor at that time, but, it was pretty clear the city was struggling to meet its budget demands, and so that went by the wayside.
But we're working on that.
I always smile when they say limited funds when you pay $3,600 a month for a mold-infested shelter.
It's true.
I smile.
It's true.
It's
true.
It is. I applaud that people are applauding that yes, the shelter system needs to get better and needs to be monitored better. Providers need to know that their funding can change during the year when they needs, there are new needs that are needed, that the city will look at those things and so forth. But we all seem to get into this conversation where there is only one type of client, and every client, and one dress fits all people, and it doesn't. It's not reality. It really isn't reality. That each client is different, and as one of the panelists said, you get the short story. Somebody comes in, and you all of a sudden they give you what they think you want to hear. Okay, and then as time goes on, they get more confidence in you. They feel more familiar with you. The story starts to unfold a little bit more, and so you constantly have to readjust the way in which you deal with the client that's in front of you. You'll see more. You may get something out of a child rather than a parent. You may get it out of a visitor who comes by rather than another service provider may offer you some insight and so forth. So I think one of the things we need to do as everyone involved in dealing with is to understand that do not reach conclusions about anyone who comes into the system from the moment and that the assessment process never stops. It never stops. You have to readjust it as more information comes out to you. And I say this to my peers all the time, especially, is that we hire people to come into this field as case managers and housing specialists and porters and safety monitors and so forth. No one goes to school for this stuff. They don't go to get a degree in case management. We have to teach this stuff to them. So you have to constantly keep retraining your students. It's an entry-level position that people are coming in.
I'm going to interrupt you a minute there. Yes,
Can I
go
make a
ahead.
point about making assumptions about people in shelter? I'm sure you all are aware of the resistance that we get in communities when we want to put a homeless shelter.
Yeah.
And you read the newspaper, and some of the demonstrations that have gone on are disgusting. And this is something that we have to deal with. And because we have this capacity crisis and don't have enough places to put the families who are applying, when we try to cite a new family shelter, these communities go crazy. And they are led by some of their elected officials. So I just throw that out when you think about, oh, all of these families are all exactly the same. It's a
I
big
have a
problem.
I agree with you. Again, you're on the same
So let's
page
get
here. I'm not saying that I would want a shelter in my neighborhood either, but it wouldn't be just because of the residents. It would be because of some of the residents and because of DHS and the relationship that they don't have with their clients and how clients are left to fend for themselves in a neighborhood that they're not familiar with, where they don't know what services are available to them, which leaves them just hanging about and not doing much of anything. Not that that's what they want to do, but because the way the system is set up and there are not currently wraparound services, your service needs are not met on an easy flow.
Right.
People are discouraged and frustrated, and they're spending more time doing less of what they could be doing because they're tired of the doors being closed. And I'm not saying it's all
Right.
agencies' fault, but we have to come together. We have to start listening to the people who are in those situations, have a better understanding of what it is they need, and start providing services from that standpoint. Stop building shelters, start paying for apartments.
But it's interesting because Commissioner Taylor said that he lives on a street in which there are 3 shelters. And he didn't even know they were shelters until he took this job. So it's very possible to have people, living in a completely integrated way in the community if you don't have this preconceived idea.
I'd like to have a better sense of how the shelter system has changed in the last year under the de Blasio administration. I want to start with Joyce. Your own experience was under the Bloomberg administration, but you're
Correct.
surely in touch with families now. Can you
Absolutely.
tell me whether there's been a difference,
A difference as far as...
either in how the people are treated, or the quality of the shelters, or the ability to find permanent
That's a
housing?
simple answer. No. No changes. Because currently I teach a life skills class at a shelter on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I listen to the women there. And they feel, one, that case managers don't have enough time. Maybe the caseloads are large, I'm not sure. They feel that they're more at risk to have ACS called on them because...
They're
when-
more at risk than they used to be.
to have ACS called. That's the same, it hasn't changed.
Yeah.
The risk is very high, because when people don't understand cultural differences and levels of stress, they think that ACS is the answer. I can tell you ACS is not the answer. I was in the shelter for several years, and I can't count the cases I had, and I consider myself a good parent. And the cases were just for misunderstandings, things they didn't know, things they were concerned about. It's easier to pass the buck, let me give it to ACS, they'll do a thorough investigation.
So-
That's not the answer.
Let me ask Christy the same thing. What changes have you seen in the past year?
I think it's hard to see any real changes in the last year. I mean, until we start seeing move-outs, I think that's going to be able to take a little pressure off the system. I think I really appreciate what Joyce said about the caseloads, and I hear the same thing from my case managers. They don't have the time that they want to spend with their clients, and they believe their clients deserve to have. And I think Joyce said something really important too earlier, which was this idea of choice. One of the biggest, if we're talking about trauma, which is what this panel is about, and you're talking about a lot of folks coming in with trauma or domestic violence experience, or either as adults or in childhood, it's about having this loss of control. And certainly every single person who ends up in a shelter, children and parents alike, have this loss of control. And one of the ways that you help people from a therapeutic point of view is you ask them, you work with them about what they want and put control back in their life. And the only way that you can really have that kind of dynamic and discussion is if you have the time to build that relationship.
Absolutely.
And so we don't have time in the shelters to really build that relationship because of various demands around caseloads and different kinds of work that has been taking place in the state. I think there's been a lot of there hasn't been enough focus on real case management and engaging in the clients in the way that we'd like, at least from when I talk to my members and I talk with the people doing case management, housing specialists, the clinical social workers. They want to spend as much time as possible because of what they want to do, and they are trained to do it, particularly the social workers, are trained to see the client holistically. And what you can do when you have time to do that, you can see the strengths, and you can help the client or the consumer see their strengths. And I think that getting at the point of what it is that folks want, because everybody wants housing, but like helping them vision, what does that mean to move out of the shelter? What does it mean to have stable housing? What is that going to look like for them? And what's their plan for maintaining that when they leave? And I think I really appreciate what you're saying about reminding us that the people that we're working with should have a say in that choice. And we have a responsibility to try and build that relationship to help engage them, because that's the only way it's going to work.
I want to drive that point home, so I'm going to say again, stop meeting with each other, start meeting with the clients more consistently.
And Anthony Graham, you had said that there was a kinder, gentler administration. Is that just a matter of tone, or is it practical?
I disagree with some of my panelists here and several things that they've said, but it's not to say that I totally disagree with them. First of all, I think this administration did something that I was very grateful to see, even though it became a pain in the butt to me for a while, and that was that they came out to the shelters and they sent the Department of Investigation and Department of Buildings and all the rest of them out to look at the shelters and said, you need to clean your act up. You know, every provider wasn't great at what they were doing, so they said to fix the units up, buy better furniture, bring in more things and so forth and so on. And yes, it may cost a little bit money and cost more and so forth, but they did something that I hadn't seen what any of the administrations previously do. And that was they went around to everybody. They were indiscriminate about how they did it. They went out, they sent the people out, they came out with a group of people from the fire department, the police department, and all the rest of it, and they walked into your shelter at 4 o'clock in the morning. If you weren't shipshape and ready to do it, they cited you for it, and you went to ECB boards, you went to all the rest of the stuff and sat there. And I think that was something that was very, very good for clients. Clients saw the city taking act and making shelters clean up their act. And I'm not saying that we're bad. I'm just saying that, yes, there comes a point in time, buildings get run down. If somebody walked in and out of you 1,500 times in the last 2 years, and you were an apartment, you'd start to get run down, and the paint doesn't look any good anymore, and all the rest of the stuff. And if it's sometimes rodent control is very difficult when somebody doesn't know to take their garbage out, and you may bring an exterminator in every 2 weeks, and when you go to the guy next door is throwing the garbage out the window, or the pamper out the window, or the rest of the stuff. Not saying every client is Joyce or anybody else, but yes, I'm just saying that they did something that no one else had done.
Janee, do you want to add in on that? Have you seen changes in the last year?
One of the most troubling changes that we are experiencing in terms of the child welfare is the use of the commercial motels. And we had one family, like a 5-year-old, special needs. We just got connected with all the services he needed to do well. Parents due to special needs were really stressed and maybe using some corporal punishment. And then they were working parents, and then suddenly found themselves placed in a commercial motel out by JFK. And the 5-year-old, who's asthmatic, sleeping under a mold ceiling. You can see the mold. They don't have a kitchen. And this child, because he's being bused to Brooklyn every morning, was being met on the way onto the bus with a bowl of cold cereal and milk to eat on the bus. For a child with ADHD, you can imagine how that went. And so that's an example of what we've seen. Now, I believe this administration has inherited a very, very troubling dynamic in this city. And some of these things, it's a mixed picture, right? So some of these things are great that they're coming out and doing better and link. And yet, the system popping at its seams, some of our families, unfortunately, are experiencing what I consider the very abuse and neglect that we at Child Welfare are trying to disrupt. It's unfortunately a system, environmental hazards that if parents were in a private apartment, we'd be saying, you're not keeping your child safe. In fact, if you do not go into the homeless shelter system, we're going to take you to family court. Those are some of the conversations I hear, and then what happens when that is the shelter unit that they're staying in and there's no radiator covers and the child's been burned, and it's pretty tough as a child welfare worker to be witnessing some of this and trying to help families do better and almost apologizing, but really feeling powerless. So I think some of the initiatives I'm hearing, we're definitely headed in the right direction, but no, things are not okay.
We hate the commercial hotels, and we are trying as hard as we can to get out of them. As, again, I'm citing Sandra, we are on the phone every week with ACS about trying to get the families out. We hope they will all be out by the end of the month. We hope. And it is a daily
That'd be amazing.
chore for us. But it's called cold comfort, but the number of families has gone down substantially. I think we've now got about 40 families when we were up around 200 at one point. So we are moving out as fast, and we hate having the families there. We don't think it's okay.
I actually want to say something. When you're talking about the daily, sort of the interactions, the operations in shelter, I'm clarifying, we're not seeing that change yet until the pressure comes off a little bit. But I do think that there's a big difference in this administration, and it's less stigmatizing of somebody being homeless. I think just the mention that there's a children's cabinet and an interagency task force is huge. I mean, we had been fighting for that for previous administrations. I think that's really important, but you're not going to see a real change, I think, particularly down on the level of the day-to-day operations or the clients, until we get a little pressure off of the system so that we can sort of step away from this one-size-fits-all. As Judge Adams mentioned, we have to place people when they place people when they come into the system. We used to in the past have a little bit more flexibility when there were less people. We could move them around so that there might be a better setting or a smaller building based on the needs, or a particular agency that has experience working with a particular family component or something like that. And I think we're going to see that down the road. But I think right now, as you're hearing from our colleagues, right now it's just not there yet. Even though there's this idea that there's a more compassionate approach. I think all of us would agree that there's publicly a compassionate approach to it. But how it's hitting on the day-to-day, I don't think it's there yet. And I think even
Absolutely.
DHS, would agree. Until we get a little pressure taking off the system, you're not going to see it.
I want to say thank you to DHS, because one, shelters are needed, and Judge Adams, I do know that the new administration is being proactive towards these changes. I just haven't seen the changes take effect yet. But I do know that Gilbert Taylor, Judge Adams, Lorraine Stevens, and Jamani Hilton are working very hard. I'm just asking for a little more community input and a little more input on the cabinets, especially the children's cabinet. When I read who was on the children's cabinet, I threw a tantrum, because there are,
Why? What do you
it
mean?
does not represent the
mean-
people who have been affected. And that's very frustrating to me, because you cannot bring the voice of the person who's been affected in the middle of a conversation. We have to be there from the ground, from the start, from the beginning. I cannot say that enough. I campaign every day to have the voices of people who've been affected heard in each and every city and state arena.
Well, have you reached out in any way to the deputy mayor,
I have,
Barrios Paoli?
yes.
And that isn't moving?
It hasn't
She's very
moved.
receptive.
Yes, she is very receptive. We met with,
We can talk about it.
Do you want to add anything?
No,
about
it's
that?
true.
I just want to add that we used to have a federal government that paid for housing.
Well,
and we
no,
don't-
the feds are out of this picture altogether. And one of the reasons that we're suffering so badly is that there is no federal money in housing anymore, where there used to be.
Can everybody hear that? Yeah.
Judge Adams, maybe you're bringing it.
Oh, no, I was just saying that we have, the federal government is out of the housing business now, and there's no federal money for housing in a way that there used to be, and that's one of the reasons that we are suffering.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit to how we can prevent trauma for little kids, you know, the babies and toddlers. I was really astonished by the figure that Kendra came up with, that kids spend an average of, was it 427 days in the shelter? And if you're a baby, that's a lifetime. And I was also astonished by the 1,800 children born in the shelters in the last year. And if they're spending an average of 427 days, that means they will learn to walk and learn to talk, and they're living in these situations that are inherently traumatizing in ways that may have lasting damage long after they move out of the shelters. So, Janee, do you want to tell me about what your program is doing to help some of these kids?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about Safe Care. And we've been operating Safe Care. We're the only operators of this Safe Care program in all of New York City. It was developed out of Georgia State University. And when I tell you about the program, I think many of you will be thinking like, duh, that's what makes sense about a parenting program. This is not a parenting group where parents sit around week after week without their children and just talk about what's hard about being a parent, which we know doesn't really have any lasting change in parenting. The research shows that. What we do at Safe Care is it's a one-on-one parenting program, and this is extremely shelter-friendly because I come to you, I'm in your unit, I'm meeting with you and your children. And what we do is we cover 3 major areas. The first is attachment and bonding. And why is that so important? Because all of this toxic stress coming from the shelter, the best inoculator of toxic stress is a parent's love, is security. We know that children who experience trauma, the best way out of it is going back to the security of a parent. So in our program, how we do, let's say, attachment with an infant, the very first time I would meet with you, if you had an infant, is I would say, for 5 minutes, pretend like I'm not here, and interact with your baby. And literally, I score you on how many times you look at your baby, touch your baby, smile at your baby, all of these behaviors that we know reflect attachment and bonding. We have had parents who have said, my baby's in their crib, that's what I do with my baby. And we've had parents who've immediately picked up their baby and kissed him all over the face, and we can score that. We can discreetly score that. What I would do over the next 5 times I'd meet with you is I would teach you how to attach and bond with your baby. I'd model it. I'd give you homework. You practice it. You show me what skill you're learning. And by the last session, which is only 6 sessions long for each module, then I'd say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, interact with your baby. And then I can see from pre-test to post-test, how far have you come? Hopefully, the skills you've learned, there's no social promotion in Safe Care. You can either do the skill or you can't. Maybe it's a history of domestic violence and your own trauma that keeps you from bonding with your baby. This model is great for picking that up and saying, what's hard about picking up your baby and kissing your baby? And you say, my mom never did that with me. Now we can talk about it. So that's the attachment and bonding. We do health decision making. So I know Judge Adams talked about parents, their baby gets a scrape on the knee and they're at the ER. Well, the health insurance companies hate that, the parents hate that, the child hates that, the doctor hates that. So let's figure out a new way. Let's, again, we start with a pre-test of giving different health scenarios, and we say, what would you do if your child was experiencing this sign or symptom of illness? And we talk through how you make that decision. We make sure by the end of that module, you are connected to a primary care physician. We make sure if you're insurance eligible that you are on your way to getting insurance. We make sure that you know how to call that doctor's office. We make sure that each of the children are connected with that primary care model, but that if you do have an emergency scenario, you can both identify it and respond appropriately. And then the third and final module that we work on developing skills is around home safety. So a parent who can identify that lack of window guards, that's a home hazard. Chemical, like cleaning products, we will never eliminate from a home, but we can make them inaccessible. And we, through Safe Care, We give the tools you need to make your home safer. We give you the cabinet locks, but we don't put them on for you. We teach you how to put them on, and we make one room really safe, and then we have you take us to a room and you show us how you can make it really safe, and we will give you all the tools you need to do it. So in 18 weeks, or 18 sessions, because some parents can move through it quicker than others, but over 18 sessions, you graduate with a level of success or mastery out of the program, and you've learned things that you may not have ever learned before, because just because you've become a parent doesn't mean you know when to take your child to the ER versus care for at home. You don't know maybe that talking to your baby who's nonverbal is actually really good for their neurodevelopment, but we teach you all of this. We are experiencing that our families in the shelter are in such a great position to receive this program because they have somebody in their home that can sit and talk with the parent about their daily stressors, but they're also learning skills that help their children listen to them better and respond to them better and facilitate security in a home. So we implemented the program in June 2013, and we're in central Brooklyn. We are very eager to expand Safe Care to all of New York City and all of the shelters, as much as the city supports us in that. But, you know, this is what we're doing right now in Crown Heights, Flatbush area.
All right. Christy, I want to ask you too about how can we prevent trauma to the small children who are spending so much time, so much of their infancy in a shelter situation?
It's a really good question, and I think first is just recognizing, as many things, that there's a problem. I crunched some numbers really quickly when Judge Adams shared the numbers of folks born in shelter and the numbers 3 and under. And so we have, there's a study that shows 10 to 26% of homeless preschool kids have some sort of mental health problems, and it came out in a study document done by the National Center on Family Homelessness. So if that's the case, we're talking 180 to 468 kids in the system fit in that category. And then the study also says 24 to 40% of school-age kids have issues. So if we take that cohort that you mentioned, we're talking somewhere between 17 and 1,800 kids. So it's a pretty significant problem. So I think the hard part, as we talked about, is it's the assessment. And there's, the assessment tool is really key, but we know there's a significant portion of kids, and I would venture to say we should be doing really deep assessment of all the kids that come through. But if we know, there's for sure those amount of kids, we really need to be looking at focusing on, there's not real predictive things, but we can, through case management, people coming in at the shelters, we can guess which are the families that need this. And so this is a pretty significant cohort, so we need to be doing better assessment.
You know what else is interesting? The numbers of children born in shelter, we ran the numbers over the past 3 years, and it went up about 300 children every year.
So we need
Why do you think that's the case?
I have no idea.
Wow.
It might have to do with the demographics of the ages of the mothers who are coming in. I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. But that's a chunk, from 1,200 to 1,500 to 1,800 in 3 years is big, but I couldn't begin to tell you why.
Yeah.
Claire, you and I had this conversation, or a conversation very similar a few months ago, when we had the privilege to speak for a few moments. And I would like to know what questions are being asked to make this assessment, because I do see that certain communities are labeled disproportionately with mental health illnesses and other things. I know that I was in a shelter, and I fought to put my children in District 2. And I will tell you, when I got my children into District 2, because I said, well, my kids are not going to school in the community and where I'm living. That's not going to happen. So when they went to District 2, I was met with a whole nother set of problems. And for the first time, I was told that my children, too, had mental illness. I was told I had a mental illness, but that's neither here nor there. Because I am a little crazy sometimes. But the point is, my children don't have mental illnesses. And I have a 24-year-old daughter who's graduated college with her marketing degree, and she's working in management for the firm that she's with. There was no mental illness. When my 7-year-old daughter threw a piece of paper, they said that she needed to be on medication because she was ADHD. They made the assumption because I lived in a shelter and they knew or felt that I had an assorted background, and that left me vulnerable, and that I think accusations were made and assumptions were made. And if I wasn't the person who I am today, my daughter would be sitting in a corner right now rocking off the medication they were giving her. So I think we have to be very careful when we start talking about who has mental illnesses and what community it's affecting.
I'm going to get back to you, Christy, but I wanted to ask Joyce about, we're all, any of us who's raised children, we all get a little crazy sometimes.
Yeah.
And there are, staying home with little kids is huge. It's the hardest work I've ever done. Harder than waitressing, you know, I mean, it really, but if I live in an ordinary apartment in the city, I'm allowed to have a neighbor over to help out. I'm allowed to take the kids off for grandma's house. Tell me a little bit about your situation in the shelter.
Well,
Christmas holidays.
It was a challenge.
Seeing the dad.
It was a challenge because I was married prior to coming into the shelter. My husband and I had recently got divorced when I entered the shelter system, and my two daughters had a very good relationship with their dad and my family and his family. And because we were in the shelter system, the shelter should be a place that builds the family up. But I felt that the shelter system was tearing me down, because when my sister came to visit from out of town with her children for holidays, my children were not allowed to be a part of the holiday festivities because they could not stay the night out. It was a shelter rule.
At grandmother's house.
Right, at grandma's house. They couldn't have weekend visits with their dad unless I took them to court for child support and all these other unnecessary factors.
And your family couldn't visit in your
Absolutely, and my
shelter,
family
right.
couldn't visit. And I would say I stayed in the shelter for 4 years because I didn't qualify for certain subsidies. So 2 years into the shelter, I started working for a corporation, making a decent salary and saving money. And when my daughter got sick, I didn't have an option of going to work because I couldn't allow a family member or a friend to come into the shelter and take care of my child. I was forced to have to stay home. So there's a lot of things that can be done to change how we support families, but that's only going to happen if we hear from families. I say again, bring the families in the community to the table from the beginning of the conversation, not in the middle or at the end.
I think,
I'm going to open it up now to questions from the audience. Do we have?
Judge Adams, I wonder if you could give us some greater detail about the 0 to 3 initiative of the Children's Cabinet, the timeline, and most importantly, how much money, if any, the administration is going to be put behind that initiative.
All right, first off, the Children's Cabinet initiative is called a place-based initiative, which is a term that's describing the work of the cabinet altogether. So what the cabinet is focusing on 0 to 3 in Brownsville and in the South Bronx. Our project is a sub-project looking at all of the children in shelter, we hope, citywide, 0 to 3. And it is inchoate, and we don't know how much money is going to be put into it, but I think some will. I don't know if you saw the mayor's budget address, but he's doing very, very well, and we have some not insubstantial reserves. So this is at the very beginning stage. I don't know how much money will go into it, but also we have a very good partner at DOHMH. Dr. Mary Bassett is really visionary, and so something good will come of it, but it's still being born.
You know, numbers go up in homelessness because rent goes up. I mean, that's like, when I was a teenager, I could work, I could get an apartment, and I could do what I want. you know. In other states, minimum wage is like $13, $14 an hour. The thing is, kids do not have themselves. All of this is about families, which is good. That's all good. But I hear nothing about the homeless situation at large. What about the adult who's homeless, okay, prior to having the kid? How they enter into adulthood, you know, from like 25 to even 40, really. Women are having babies at 45, whatever. And they are treated like garbage because they do not have a child. They cannot get any service. This is male and female. And now all of a sudden they have a child. Of course they're going to be in the system, you know? And we could start just the way you treat people in general, education, fairness, and all of that. But you cannot just focus on the family after the fact. You have to focus on the individual so they have enough self-respect and enough skills when they get knocked up or whatever, they're ready to deal with it. What are you doing about homeless people, period? Single homeless people. People. Everybody is worth something.
Anybody care to answer that?
She's absolutely right.
She's absolutely right. Okay. Let's see, Jackie, yeah.
My question is this. When you look at the homeless situation in this city and really throughout this country, a lot of it is built on race. And what race and education in the community is happening within our various communities. I have looked on the TV every day, and I hear stuff about ISIS recruiting this one, recruiting that one, and ISIL recruiting the other one, and so forth and so on. They seem to be very effective at educating their respective communities about their good works. What is being done to educate the communities that we live in about the needs to find shelters for our homeless citizens who are tax-paying citizens on whatever level they are?
Anybody want to answer that one?
I think one of the things that you agree with you. How do we get better at making sure that our communities, race, whatever it is, and whatever way you're going to define what homelessness is and who it affects and so forth, that we have to get better. We have to get better as people to stand up for ourselves. As Joyce has said over and over again, we have to stand up for ourselves more. We have to sit down and define what we want, what we need, and how we're going to go about getting it. The other portion of it is I just sit down and I understand that there are some very good stories that come out of shelters. Everybody who goes into a shelter does not come out of that with a horror story every time they walk in. A lot of people walk out with very good results that come out of it and so forth. We just have to get better at what we're doing. My mother used to always say that, if you forget your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And one of the things that we're doing right now is that, we're sitting down and we're lambasting shelters, saying they're horrible places, they're absolutely horrible places to have. What we need is apartments. We need apartments. We need apartments. Yes, we do. And there's nothing wrong with that statement. But the other portion of it is that those of us who are in this field, we understand that you can give a person an apartment all day, but can they sustain it? Okay? If you get into an apartment, are you able to keep that apartment? Because if you lose that apartment, will that ACS person be involved in your life? Yes, they probably will. Will the if you're in there and you don't take care of the property, will the landlord not renew your lease? Yes, he will or she will not renew your lease. Okay,
I'm gonna take another question now.
Good morning. I work for the Brooklyn Public Library. I'm the coordinator of hospital storytelling, and we're a family literacy program. I send volunteers out, some contractors, to read to kids and give them free books in medical institutions. And we also work with homeless shelters, apart from other places. And in my personal life, I work with Fourth World Movement. And they also do a street library at the Jamaica shelter, I believe. What I'm not hearing is literacy. All throughout this, to answer the last three questions, long-term change requires literacy, family literacy, children's literacy. It doesn't sound like the program, the Children's Cabinet, is going to work for the critique that the woman just gave. It's too top-down. It's not empowering. It's not participatory. You have to start with the children. You have to speak to them and their parents and get what they need from them, the information to solve their own problems. Even people who are homeless can read a book to a child, and they do in my program. The lady, the judge, talked about gentrification. That's pushing homeless, making people homeless, and she talked about it in places where the library has branches and homeless people use their services, and they're not given enough support. Brownsville, Bed-Stuy, East New York, we see the writing on the wall. You can send services right out there right now, and we'd help a lot of homeless people and their children.
I'm going to cut you off so that we have time for plenty of questions.
I'd like to
Anybody
answer
want to
that
respond
one.
to that?
I want to respond to that one.
Yeah.
I want to respond to that one because I have been a long-term advocate of removing district lines for school systems. I personally believe that district lines keep people trapped in neighborhoods where the resources are already low and where needs of the community are not being met. Literacy is something that will open the door and even the playing field for everyone. And I think that children should be able to go to whatever school their parents can get them to on time, where the educational education that they receive is fair across the board. Open it up.
Can I just respond to that? Because I think it's important to talk about what's being addressed around employment and education. And previously, and I see a couple of providers here, I see Alex Brucevansky when he was at VOA. He remembers this period when we had GED classes, support classes in the shelter systems for the families. We also, at that same period of time, this is pre-recession, we also had recreation services, and HSG fought with our members to keep what we could of the recreation services, but they were slashed in the budget. And what I think the gentleman is talking about, and a few other folks are talking about, recreation services, education services are core services. They should be important services, and they should follow the people as they leave the shelter. But what those services did was get at, recreation wasn't just taking kids to a baseball game, it was allowing kids to be kids, which is a very protective measure against trauma. Because kids react to trauma because it's a traumatic experience, and that's normal, but they also should be able to act like kids. And so things like recreation services being adequately funded or even baselined into people's budgets, things like GED training and classes, things like that, being available in the shelters are really important for the parents, and it's important for the kids too to see their parents study. So we used to have a period when we had that. And I would love to see a day when we have that again. It's an important piece of that would be that it follows people when they go back into the community, so that it's available to them when they come in, but it's something that follows them when they leave.
But you're right about being very specific about literacy. There's something particular about reading. And yeah, absolutely.
But I think a lot more basic than this, okay, is that everyone is sitting here is probably working for some human services organization, period, or a shelter. Open your doors, go to the shelters open your doors, and welcome those organizations bringing in services to your clients. That's what you need to do. You need to stop sending your clients to tell them to go 16 blocks away because you're going to lose them. They're not going to make it there. Have them come in. If you have an office, you have a room, you have a multi-purpose room, open your doors and say, can you come in and do this once an hour, once a week? Can you come in and do this? Bring your services to us, and we open up our doors and make sure we're available to you, okay? And therefore, the clients and you and us all work in tandem with each other, and stop all of us thinking that we're fighting over clients. They're all there for each of us. We're all there to help support each other, and we silo each other so much that we lose people.
Those of you who are trying to get my attention, there are two people with microphones, and Jackie over here and Andrea over here. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, yes. I have a question. I'm actually a preventive service provider.
I'm sorry, could you stand up? I
Oh,
can't see
sure.
you.
I'm
Yeah.
a preventive service provider, and all too often we see families who are homeless go back into the shelter system. And Judge Adams, you spoke briefly about the LINK programs, and I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more towards the long-term sustainability of those subsidies.
Well, part of the LINK program is aftercare. So any family that gets placed in an apartment through LINK gets at least 1 year of intensive aftercare, hoping to avoid fall off and return.
Told you this administration was changing things, right?
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Desita Gray, and I'm a certified infant toddler specialist. I'm also the facilitator of the Infancy Leadership Circle in Harlem, which focuses on 0 to 3. So my question, I've gone to this shelter several times offering our services because we do classes for moms and babies to show them how to get their babies ready for school. Because one of the things the research shows is that at 9 months, the average Black and Latino baby is already behind in their cognitive skills. Yeah. And by 24 months, they're 3 times behind. So when they get to kindergarten, they're 24 months behind. So my question is to the judge, are you going to be partnering with community organizations like myself who are already providing these services?
Indeed, we will. And do you work primarily through DOHMH?
No, well, I have my own company, which I started 3 years ago because of the statistics. Because we're always talking, but I feel that parent education is paramount in helping both kids to grow up and become responsible.
All right, if you have a card.
Sure, I do. I have several cards.
Give it to me and I'll.
I do, no, because it's really, we really need, it doesn't really take a lot of money to get kids ready. It takes knowledge. And the idea is to empower the providers with the knowledge so they could be better parents.
So I will, please give me your information and I
Sure.
will pass it on to the administration.
But I think DHS already does this. They already tell every shelter to go out there and develop linkages for services. They ask you to do this. Well, the point about it is sometimes you do stuff without getting paid for it, sometimes, and sometimes that will lead to somebody also paying you. But if we're all sitting around waiting for a contract to be developed where we'll get paid before we can offer services, then it's not going to be successful.
Let's have another question now, here.
Is it my turn? Yeah, okay, just waiting my turn. Hi, I'm Jane Aronson, and I'm the CEO of Worldwide Orphans Foundation. I'm probably the only one here who's from a global setting. So we're here, my team is here. You've all done an amazing job. I'm very inspired. Thank you so much. We're here to learn. We've worked in 14 countries abroad. We now work in 5 countries, and we're specialists in the area of early childhood development. Thank you for your work. And we do something called Toy Library. And I want to give you my card. That's why I'm here. And nothing should ever be free, ever, never. All of you in this room.
That's right.
I come from a world of begging. And the people we employ get paid. Nobody here should be giving any free services. We should be giving humanity and love and care and devotion. But no, not paying. Everyone needs to be paid for their services because we're all professionals. But what I wanted to contribute here is the following, and that is that I'm a pediatrician by training. And if we don't, there's really 2 important things we need to do is save the planet as an environment, but the next best thing we need to do is make sure that children are healthy. And I'm really amazed at how we're all the same. I'm working in worlds where, there's 2.2 billion children in the world and there's 7 billion adults. A third of the planet is children, and we're still not enforcing the rights of the child, the Convention of the Rights of Child, which is 25 years old, which is a beautifully poetic organization. Anyway, so I want to just share, my final comment is, I want to know more about the strategy of the City of New York. I'm trying to learn about the deindustrialized cities around the United States because we would like to deploy our toy libraries in Orange, New Jersey. We're in Maplewood, New Jersey. We'd like to go to Detroit and Camden and Trenton and Philadelphia. We'd like to be, out there trying to, be part of a movement afoot to really take care and prevent. From the minute the child takes a breath, a child needs protection and love and play. By the way, I never heard the word play today. I heard, very interesting.
Yes, you did.
Okay, no, we didn't, the word, the P didn't come out. It there was some like phrases around it, but finally the word play is really the secret to helping children at the end of the day. So
Anybody
thank
want to
you.
respond to that? On some of the, if you've got questions instead of comments.
I think there's been a question over here. Yeah. We're going to come away with my card. I'm curious to hear that question.
Hello, everyone. I'm currently a graduate student here at the new school. I'm also the outreach manager for the Pre-K for All outreach team. And I'm curious to know, could you elaborate on what resources DHS will be providing this year for families who are non-English speaking or limited English proficiency? Thank you.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Well, that's something that should be taken into consideration, especially when we're talking about protecting children from trauma, in particular those families.
Very good point.
Thank you.
I do want to defer to my colleagues who actually run shelters, and the shelters do a very good job on making sure that they have bilingual, whether it's French, whether it's Spanish. I want to say that you guys should answer that question.
Well, I want to say that even though I'm not a shelter provider, as a child welfare provider, where we're teaching parents to play with their children, we do offer safe care in Creole. We offer it in Spanish. And we also, it's a curriculum-based, but many of our parents are illiterate, so it is picture-based, learning how to make health decisions for their children. So safe care is actually also internationally. It's in Belarus. It's in South America. This is a worldwide child parenting program in so many different languages. So those are just the ones that we see the most need for in central Brooklyn. But I am not a shelter
Well, I am.
person.
You are. Anthony.
I am, and we do. We hire, we in our hiring practices, from safety monitors, porters, to recreation specialists, to case managers, social workers, the executives. We ask for them to speak different languages, and so forth. So we go French, we Swahili, anything that we possibly think our client base will have and have that need. If not, then we attach ourselves to the language lab that's out there, so we can facilitate conversations and that sort of thing. We're trying to do the best job we possibly can do with the limited funds that we have. Okay, so we ask everybody,
Which are extremely limited.
Because they're spending it on shelters.
No.
I want to say something too about this idea that you're getting at. New York City is a really beautifully diverse city. And so one of the things that we push from Homeless Services United, we do training, advocacy, and policy. In our training component, we don't just have a cultural competency class, because that doesn't work. Because every aspect of case management or engagement with the client, you have to have a cultural lens to what you're doing. You have to really understand it. And when I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about race, class, gender, orientation, all of those things. So that when you're doing, we have a training on boundaries and professionalism, what does that mean across different cultures? You could come off one culture, if you have very, a little bit colder, you're being seen as being cold, when in reality it's how the culture you grew up in. And so it's really important that we pay attention to that, not just from how the delivery side, from our side, but also to understand the receiving side of the people on the receiving end of that. Because there's a lot of different ways that people respond to shame and trauma and stress, and we have to have a really good understanding of that. So I think that's a really good question, and thank you for bringing that up.
We're just going to take one more question.
Hi. Hi, I'm Alyssa Bernstein. I had a question regarding the trauma of being in a shelter for children. The client code of conduct, one of the things that you mentioned was visitors, visitation, and also in the Child Welfare Watch article that was brought up. I was wondering if that's on the table to be revised. I know it's like a legal document. Is that a part of the discussion, revising that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that was the answer.
That's the answer.
I like these short answers. Jackie says we have time for one more. So.
Hi. Yes, so I have two parts. I used to work at Bronx Work for the homeless outreach team. So I know there used to be Work Advantage and all those other programs, but then they would expire after 3 years, and then the family would end up back in the shelter system. So I know the new mayor's address, he did mention that he had new programs coming out. Will they be the same where they would expire as well? And as such as with Anthony, I'm really excited about the new administration, But I know as an ACS worker now, I take my clients to PATH, and they're often found ineligible because they have an aunt that they lived with 3 years ago that they can't stay there now, and now they have nowhere to go, but PATH won't take them. Is that going to be addressed as well?
Me? All right. Your first question was the duration of these subsidies. The Advantage, what happened with Advantage was a state and city program. And the state pulled out, and the city decided that without the state, they weren't going to pick up the slack, so that ended. Ours are of limited duration, and I honestly, I don't have the 1, 2, 3, I think the max is 5 years.
5 years.
Because you can't live on it forever. And your second question was eligibility. There are two eligibility criteria. One is failure to provide needed documents. So if you haven't provided a birth certificate or a marriage certificate or a death certificate, if you're there because of the death of a family member, you're deemed ineligible, but that's always cured. The second is that there is another viable residence, and that's always very, very subjective. And the way it works now, and I don't know if it's always going to be this way, is that PATH has staff who go and interview, say, you're required to document your last 2 years of residence when you apply, and being very specific about addresses, who you lived with. PATH goes and interviews every single person that you listed as having lived with in the past 2 years and said, can she come back and live with you? And if that person says yes, and if the house appears habitable with enough room for the family, there will be an ineligibility determination. That's appealable, and you are entitled to a fair hearing on that, and sometimes we're overruled. But
I've had people say, no, they can't come live with me, and PATH still won't take them.
it's very subjective, it's very difficult. And we have out-of-country eligibility, too, because New York is a right-to-shelter city.
Yeah.
So people do, in fact, come from Kennedy Airport and present at PATH. And they've been living for the past 10 years with their mother in England. And so PATH will get on the phone and talk to the mother, and the mother will say, oh, yes, they can come back. They lived here all of their lives. The children went to school here. They know me. So it's hard.
The thing is, I think we have to change the face of what homelessness is. Because if I live with you, I'm still homeless. I have a place to stay, but I am homeless. Yes. So I think that's something that should be looked at.
Right, but the tension is that it's true, you may have been living with a friend, but that was not your home. On the other hand, we have so many people, we're putting them in commercial hotels, which are unacceptable. So we have to figure out a way to balance this all out.
I agree with that, but homeless is
I think what
homeless.
Jackie's saying, we need more affordable housing.
No.
And that's it. And I think everyone agrees on that. That whether that's something that's going to be possible for this administration to do within the next 3 years is something that I think we waited 12 years for another administration to try to do it. So let's be a little bit realistic about what we can do, and we need to start doing that we need to start advocating and getting in those conversations from the beginning with developers, and we're meeting with HPD and agencies such as that about who's developing, where they're developing, is it going to be affordable housing, how much affordable housing, and what's it going to be. But the other thing that we have to realize, rents go up. Sometimes people can't afford those rents, and sometimes it. And a friend of mine outside in Westchester said something to me just recently, part of the Supportive Housing Network. And he came up to me and said, Tony, I got this great statistic for you, and you're going to be shocked. We did a study over the last 5 years from Westchester and so forth, our young adults, where are they going? Because they don't see, we saw a drain happen. He said 68% of the young adults in Westchester are moving to New York City.
Everybody moves to New York City. New York City is one of the few cities in the country.
Moving is because of, one is the jobs are here. There are more jobs here than in Westchester. The other thing is, I can go out drinking and have a good time and all the rest of the stuff and get on the subway and get on a bus and get home. Westchester, I get in the car, there's a possibility I may not make it home, I may get arrested and all the rest of the stuff. And the third thing is, 6 of us can live in one apartment. 5 of us can live in a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom apartment and share the rent, and the rent becomes reasonable. Whereas if it's $2,300, you divide that up by 5 people or 4 people, it now becomes reasonable. I'm paying $700 rather than paying $2,300 to live. And that's what's
Okay,
taking
we
away
have,
a lot of-
really, this is the last question.
Hi, I'm Nick Moore. I'm a graduate student at New School, domestic violence survivor, and was 5 years in a shelter with my children who are now 7 and 9, so I'm exactly the kind of person you guys are talking about. First of all, Joyce, I very much agree with you. Thank you much.
Thank you.
The question I have is, as there's only one path as a domestic violence survivor, I was in a situation where I was fleeing my husband's, our marital home, and given that there was only one intake for the shelter, he knew where it was.
Yeah.
And so I had to walk around with 5 bags, 2 kids, in the neighborhood, calling friends, trying to make sure to see when he wasn't standing in front of it, because he had enrolled some of his friends. So just for me to get out of the situation and get into a shelter, my children to this day are traumatized by the situation. We had the advantage, and then lost the advantage, had to go back in the shelter. And so I want to know, is there something that's going to be addressing domestic violence survivors and giving them a chance to actually get, at least however horrible it is, to get into the shelter, because at this point with one centralized space, it is absolutely impossible for a lot of
Well, as
people.
I say, we're thinking about decentralizing, and the Link 3 subsidy is specifically for survivors of domestic violence, in addition to HRA has a NOVA problem.
Right. But that's only after
Freudian slip.
But that's only after you are in the shelter, and yes, it is a problem. I've been there.
In any event, that's another
Yeah, I
source
think
of
you're getting
shelter.
at the point of between the systems, like what, we could definitely be doing a better job.
But what I'm really trying to make the point and ask the question is to consider that your clients have different needs, and are you listening to your clients? Are you actually asking people who are survivors? Are you asking people in the shelter system? Because if a bunch of academics are sitting together, then that's the problem. Then there is a huge problem. And
There's also an issue. There's also a thing of there is the domestic violence system and shelter systems in the city has to be expanded. It has to there have to be more safe horizons, and that system and how you get into it through that system needs to be updated so that it's a lot better. There are more beds, there are more shelter providers who provide that service, so that you don't have to go through PATH to get into a DV shelter, because
for the trauma
I'm gonna-
shelter, which I know is in the report, but it is
I'm going to wrap it up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
traumatized
Yeah.
even more by the shelter and by the system. Then they already come traumatized out of it, and then the children don't have mental health problems; they have behavioral issues, which is completely
emotional
different.
issues.
I'm going to wrap it up there, and I want to thank the panelists for coming and for taking some of these very tough questions and wrestling with these very tough issues. And I want to thank all of you for coming to the Center for New York City at the New School. Center for New York City Affairs at the New School.
Gotta get out.